I'm Mark, a young man in the prime of his life, was frolicking in the Mediterranean waves and basking in the warm sunshine. The university had granted me some time to enjoy my favorite hobby, fishing. I found indescribable pleasure in this activity, a chance to escape the city's hustle and immerse myself in the tranquility of nature. Every weekend, I would drive my small car to that beloved coastal spot, where towering rocks and clear waters awaited. I relished those moments spent alone with my fishing rod and bait, watching the lure float in the water and eagerly waiting for a fish to bite. On that fateful day, I was lying on one of the rocks, my eyes closely monitoring the bait. Suddenly, I felt an unexpected tug on the fishing line. I pulled hard, but what I felt wasn't the weight of a fish, it was something heavy and strange. When I reeled the lure to the surface, an old, tattered bag appeared, with the bait firmly caught in it. Curiosity drove me to open the bag, and despite the inner warnings that I was making a mistake, I couldn't resist the temptation. When I opened the bag, a foul stench wafted out, making me grimace. Inside, I saw something I could never have imagined, a collection of scattered bones, some large and some small. I couldn't determine whether they were human or animal bones, but I was sure that something was very wrong. Nausea crept through my body, and my hands began to tremble. I tried to turn away from that horrifying sight, but I couldn't. I kept staring at the bones, trying to understand how they got there and who had placed them in the bag. At that moment, I realized I was in big trouble. I could no longer enjoy fishing. Instead, I felt fear and dread. I decided to report what I had found to the police immediately. After I reported to the police what I had found, they quickly arrived at the location. They were seasoned men, their faces reflecting experience and seriousness. They cordoned off the area and began meticulously examining the bag and bones. They took photos and video recordings of the place and the bones, then carefully collected them in special bags. I told them everything I had seen, describing the bag and the beach where I had found it. They listened to me attentively, then asked me to come with them to the police station to give my statement. At the police station, I provided a detailed statement, recounting everything that had happened to me from the moment I found the bag until the police arrived. I felt relieved when I learned they would do everything they could to solve the mystery of those bones. Several days later, I received a call from one of the detectives. He told me they had sent the bones to the lab for examination and that the initial results indicated they were human. My heart sank when I heard those words. I never imagined the situation would be this serious. The detective began asking me for any information that might help them in the investigation. He asked me about the people I knew in the area and any conflicts that might have occurred among them. I told him everything I knew, but I couldn't provide any useful information. The detective also told me they had received reports of missing persons in the area recently and suspected that the bones might belong to one of these missing individuals. This information increased my confusion and anxiety. I never imagined I would become part of a murder case. Long days passed while I was stuck in a whirlpool of anxiety and anticipation. I closely followed the news of the investigation, always wondering about the identity of the owner of those bones, and what motives led the killer to dispose of the body in such a gruesome manner. One day, I decided to return to the place where I had found the bag. I wanted to see the location again and make sure that everything was over. When I reached the beach, I felt a strange awe. The place looked calm and beautiful as always, but I felt that something had changed. I began to wander on the beach, trying to remember every detail of that fateful day. Suddenly, I saw something strange buried in the sand. I approached it and began to dig around it gently. After a while, a small metal piece appeared. When I looked at it closely, I found that it was a thin gold chain. I held the chain and contemplated it. A shiver ran through my body. Was this chain owned by the person to whom the bones belonged? Was it a new piece of evidence in this case? I decided to report what I had found to the police immediately. When I told them about the chain, they asked me to hand it over to them. They took it for examination and told me they would compare it with any other evidence they might have found. Shortly afterward, I received a call from the detective. He told me they had managed to identify the owner of the bones. He was a man in his 30s who had been missing for several months. The detective added that they had found some evidence indicating that the man had been murdered and that the perpetrator might be someone who knew him well. I felt a great shock when I heard this news. I could not imagine that the killer could be someone close to the victim. I asked the detective for any other details, but he refused to tell me anything more. After I learned the identity of the victim, I began to feel intense fear. I no longer felt safe anywhere. I was afraid that the killer was watching me and knew all my movements. I started avoiding going out and spent most of my time in my room. One night, I suddenly woke up to the sound of knocking on the window. I sat up in bed, terrified, and looked around the room for the source of the sound. I found nothing. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the sound came again, this time clearer. I got out of bed and went to the window, quietly lifting the curtain. I saw no one outside the house, but I felt piercing eyes watching me. I was horrified, rushed to the door, and locked it firmly. The next day, I decided to report what happened to the police. I told them about the knocking on the window and my feeling of being watched. They listened attentively and promised to intensify their investigation. Shortly after, I received a call from the detective. He told me they had found some new evidence that might help them catch the killer. He refused to give me any more details, but I felt like I was getting closer to solving the mystery. I began to feel slightly better knowing the police were working hard to solve the case. I hoped the killer would be caught quickly so I could return to my normal life. Long days passed as I lived in a state of anxiety and anticipation. I was eagerly waiting for the police to call me with updates on the case. Finally, the day I had been anxiously waiting for arrived. I received a call from the detective, informing me that they had managed to catch the killer. I was shocked when I learned the identity of the killer. It was my neighbor, a man who seemed quiet and religious. I never imagined he could have any connection to a murder. The detective came to my house and explained the details of the case to me. It turned out that the neighbor owed the victim a large sum of money and had been threatened with the exposure of some private matters if he didn't pay off his debt. The neighbor decided to get rid of the victim to solve the problem. After killing the victim, he dismembered the body, placed it in a bag, and threw the bag into the sea. The necklace that I found belonged to the victim, and the neighbor had deliberately hidden it. I felt anger and sadness when I heard this story. I never imagined that someone I knew could commit such a heinous crime. The neighbor was brought to trial and sentenced to life imprisonment. I felt relieved when I learned that justice had prevailed. After this incident, I decided to leave the area and move to another place. I no longer felt safe there and feared for my life. Years passed, and I gradually forgot what had happened. But whenever I passed by the sea, I would remember those difficult days. Before we continue, if you liked the video, subscribe to the channel and share the video so we can continue creating more stories. The day was passing like any other day at my high school, but it quickly turned into a day I would never forget. I was in the 10th grade, that adolescent stage where boredom mixes with curiosity, and the desire to rebel coexists with the fear of the unknown. I was wandering through the school halls, watching my classmates whisper and exchange jokes, while I was lost in my own world. At some point, the principal announced in his usual calm voice that there would be a school lockdown. At first, I didn't take it seriously. I thought it was just a routine drill. But that idea quickly faded when I saw how the school transformed from a place full of life to a quiet and frightening place. Our teacher tightly closed the door, blocked the windows, and drew the curtains. Deadly silence filled the classroom, and we could hear our hearts beating. Strange thoughts began to swirl in my head. What's happening? Is there a real threat? Will we be okay? All these questions were running through my mind with no answer. I remembered the times we watched horror movies, and how we got scared of every sound or strange movement. Now, I was feeling the same fear, but this time it was real. I imagined strange people sneaking into the school, carrying weapons, and committing acts of violence. I started watching my classmates closely, looking for any signs of fear or panic. But everyone was eerily calm, as if they had turned into statues. I tried to focus on my breathing and calm myself down, but it was no use. Every minute passed very slowly, and every sound made my heart leap in my chest. I felt trapped in a small classroom, unable to escape. At that moment, I heard a faint sound coming from outside the classroom. It was a strange sound. I couldn't determine what it was. Was it the sound of someone breathing? Footsteps? Or just an illusion? My heart rate increased, and I felt sweat covering my forehead. Is this it? Has it begun? After the terrifying silence took over the classroom, a feeling of anxiety began to creep into my heart. I looked around at my classmates and found their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. I tried to calm myself, but the fear grew with each passing second. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound coming from the window. It was a slight rustling, as if something was trying to sneak in. I turned towards the window and saw a shadow moving slowly on the curtain. My heart began to pound violently, and my breathing became quick and shallow. I exchanged looks with my classmates and saw the terror reflected in their eyes. We tried to focus on the sound, but the more we tried, the more our fear increased. Some students began whispering softly, trying to make sense of what was happening. "I think there's someone outside," one student whispered with a trembling voice. "There can't be anyone, the teacher locked the door tightly," another student said. "Maybe it's an animal," suggested a third student, but I knew this explanation wasn't convincing. At that moment, we heard another sound, this time a light scratching at the door. My body trembled, and I felt like I was about to scream. I looked at the door and imagined seeing eyes peeking through the small crack at the bottom. "I think we should scream," one of the girls said with a trembling voice. "No, don't," I quickly said to her, "we might anger it." I didn't know what to do. I wanted to get out of this situation, but I was too scared to move. I remained seated, hoping this nightmare would end soon. The questions started swirling in my head. What's happening? Is it inside or outside the school grounds? Are we safe? Is it dangerous? Will we be attacked? I am a very strong man, so I was ready to fight if necessary. I tried to listen for any sudden sounds of an intrusion, but nothing happened. There was no sound. After some time, I started to get bored because nothing was happening. Each passing minute annoyed me more until finally, the school was released from lockdown. At lunch, there was a rumor that someone had held the principal with a knife. Fortunately, no one was injured, and I believe the person was expelled.